Welcome to Social Aloe Ministries, where we are committed to glorifying God while exposing the devil. I'm going to take some time to look at two things that I actually enjoy. And it's about root cause analysis and blame shifting, because they go hand in hand. A lot of times you hear a person's story and you may want to cast blame somewhere, and in some cases the story may be your own and you want to blame others because you're looking at the bad fruit, but you're not looking at the root of the issue. So we're about to get below the surface and look at some issues. First, I'm going to present a part of a real life case, and I'm going to present some real life cases from the Bible. There are times, for example, you hear someone talking about how they're suffering from heartbreak. And when you hear the story, it's kind of like you may blame one person for breaking the other person's heart. But if you were to truly get into the heart of the matter, you'd realize that the person whose heart is now quote unquote broken, that person caused the heartbreak. The shortest quote unquote marriage that I know of lasted for 3 days. And it is because a woman used witchcraft to include misusing the Lord's name in vain, to force a man who did not love her, wasn't attracted to her, didn't want anything to do with her, couldn't even stand being in the same room with her. But again, as a result of witchcraft and misusing the Lord's name, a month after they met face to face, basically they were having a ceremony. The ceremony was on a Friday. He refused to kiss her. Never hugged her. Never told her that he had any feelings for her. But one day she gave him a list of probably about 10 things that she just absolutely loved about him. And that put him in turmoil because he did not love her. And he was wondering how God truly wanted him to marry her. But then the Lord opened his eyes and he saw the light. So they got married on a Friday, and on a Monday, he put her out of the house and filed for divorce. But based on laws, it would take 90 days to go to court to complete the divorce. And they give people 90 days just in case they change their mind. But as an example of the witchcraft, the woman, after being served divorce papers, actually changed her last name to match his. Now, maybe a part of her rationale was to make the man think that the quote-unquote union was of God, and that the Lord had instructed her to change her name to match his. And notice I say to match his, not taking his last name, because his last name wasn't hers to have. I mean, they had been married for 3 days. She knew, or at least she should have known, that he didn't love her, didn't want anything to do with her. He was manipulating that position. Once the Lord opened his eyes, he put her out, at least put her back where she was before, and filed for divorce. And he wasn't going to change his mind, especially after finding out how a person manipulated him. And not only manipulated him, but also used the Lord's name in vain while doing so. But it only further validated that she had used witchcraft by changing her last name to match his, in some part to make him think that the Lord had ordained their union and that he was going to bring them together. Well, they never got back together, and they will never get back together. So even though they had only seen each other face to face for a month, they never went on a date, he never loved her, they basically got divorced after 3 days, but she still changed her last name to match his. Even months later, she still tried coming back into his life as if she had a place to begin with. Now, what made that woman do all those things? If you were to ask her, she'd probably tell you that the union was of God and X, Y, and Z. But that is looking at the fruit, not the root. She'd probably also tell you that the man is being disobedient by not being with her. But it's like, disobedient to who? Her or God? Because if God told him to get out and he got out, then he's obeying God. So that's a real life example of how sometimes people do things to, in a sense, break their own hearts, but then they'll blame others regarding why it happened. But if you look at the fruit and not get the full story, you may miss it. So you truly have to do root cause analysis to find out where this thing went wrong. See, in the Bible, there's a story of Leah and Jacob. And just because they stayed married, there are some people who they may have the impression that if they can just trap someone and get them to walk down the aisle, so to speak, or make that vow, then the Lord's going to uphold it. Kind of like how he did with Jephthah. But the Lord is not going to stand for deception. In John 10, the Lord talks about how his sheep will not be plucked from his hands. No one's going to pluck his sheep from his hands. So the devil, he's making a sad mistake if he thinks that, for example, when it comes to a quote-unquote marriage, that if he pairs two people together, that the Lord is going to force his son or daughter to stay with a daughter or son of the devil. But I don't know all the facts of that case, so I can't really do full root cause analysis. But there's some examples in the Bible. One of the first things we'll look at is blame shifting. In Genesis 3, and I'll actually back up by starting Genesis 2. The Lord said it wasn't good for the man to be alone, so he made a suitable helper for him. He put him to sleep, took one of his ribs, presented him with Eve, and he was like, "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh." They were joined in holy matrimony. The Lord was in that relationship. But in Genesis 3, verses 8 through 12, after the devil had misled Eve, and Eve misled Adam, so they both sinned. And they heard the voice of the Lord God walking in the garden in the cool of the day. And Adam and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord God amongst the trees of the garden. And the Lord God called unto Adam and said unto him, "Where art thou?" And he said, "I heard thy voice in the garden, and I was afraid, because I was naked and I hid myself." And he said, "Who told thee that thou wast naked?" Well, one of the things, when Adam and Eve ate the forbidden fruit, their eyes were opened. There are times when you will get into a bad position because of witchcraft, manipulation, people pulling the wool over your eyes, so to speak. But when you see the light, well, Adam and Eve, they saw bad light, but when you see the light and the Lord is pointing you in a direction, that is where you need to go. So, hast thou eaten of the tree whereof I commanded thee that thou shouldest not eat? The Lord already knew. The Lord already knew. And like the story I mentioned earlier, like the woman may be saying, "But the man made a vow. How can he break my heart like this?" The Lord knew all the facts. The Lord saw all the manipulation. When the Lord judges, he does root cause analysis. An example of that, John chapter 8, verses 1 through 11, with the woman who had been caught committing adultery. Jesus could have just said, yes, she was committing adultery, put her to death. But he knew the motives that the Pharisees had. And that's a part of the reason why he let the woman go, why he set her free. Because he knew their motives. In Matthew 23, Jesus called the Pharisees and the scribes children of hell. So he realized that regardless of how they looked on the outside, he knew what was going on the inside. Trust the Lord whenever he liberates you from anywhere. When he judges righteously. He just doesn't judge the facts that people present. He judges the whole truth. He doesn't simply judge the fruit. He judges down to the roots. In fact, in Matthew 7, he tells us about false prophets, and how he talks about how we know them is based on their fruit. And the fruit comes basically from the root. It feeds the fruit. Okay, back to verse 12 of Genesis 3. And the man said, the woman whom thou gavest to me. I'll say that again. And the man said, the woman whom thou gavest be with me, or correction, gavest to be with me, she gave me the tree and I did eat. I'll say that again. And the man said, the woman whom thou gavest to be with me, she gave me of the tree and I did eat. Thing is, the Lord had told Adam something in Genesis 2, verse 16. And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, of every tree of the garden thou mayest eat or freely eat, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil thou shalt not eat of it, for in the day that thou eatest thereof thou shalt surely die. Eve, with her eating of the fruit, it's like, okay, the devil seduced her. She heard it, or possibly she heard it from Adam. So okay. But for Adam, who heard it directly from God, for him to take the fruit, the forbidden fruit from Eve and eat it, he can't blame her. But what he did was blame shifting. Yes, but Eve was only the fruit. His disobedience to God was the root. But he was blame shifting, as opposed to accepting responsibility. And God, being a righteous judge, you notice that when you go along in Genesis chapter 3, the Lord judges the serpent, the woman, and the man. He judged all three of them. When the Bible talks about the Lord searches our hearts, and even that he knows our thoughts when they're far off, he knows people's motives. He knows when people are pretending to be righteous, but on the inside, they have darkness. He knows when people are saying one thing, but when you go down to the roots, it's just not good. In some cases, people are selling you a story, and it's like they're selling you a house, but the house has a basement, but they don't want you to go down in the basement and take a look, because the basement is where the foundation is. But there is more. In 2 Samuel 12, or correction, 2 Samuel 11, this story continues in 2 Samuel 12, when Nathan rebuked David for committing adultery. And you can say conspiracy to murder. But the story unfolds in 2 Samuel 11. I'm going to share just a bit of that with you. But then I'm also going to do a little bit of root cause analysis. Because there's some ministers, they will tell you the root cause of what happened in 2 Samuel 11. But it runs much deeper than that. Root cause analysis it goes down truly to the heart of the matter. In some cases, some of the things you're doing as an adult is because of the things that happened to you as a child. Some things you're doing as an adult may be because of the things the devil did to you as a child. Sometimes you can't have healthy relationships because you need inner healing for those childhood wounds. In 2 Samuel 11, and I'll read verses 1 through 5. And it came to pass, after the year was expired, at the time when kings go forth to do battle, that David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel. And they destroyed the children of Ammon and besieged Rabbah. But David tarried still at Jerusalem. Many ministers, when they do root cause analysis, that's another thing. Sometimes people go to ministers for spiritual advice, and those ministers don't rely on the Holy Spirit of the Lord. They take things at face value. They don't do true root cause analysis. And it doesn't always have to be going back to childhood, but sometimes, and I'll use the example of the marriage that I mentioned, the quote-unquote marriage. You may see a situation that has unfolded. It's like an explosion, so to speak, a volcano that erupted. But are these ministers looking at what caused the volcano to erupt? And especially for a quote-unquote God-ordained marriage, like I mentioned, to fall apart in 3 days. And the witchcraft got so bad where the woman used the Lord's name, saying that the Lord was giving the man 30 days to consummate the marriage with her. That is how bad it was, because he did not even want to have sex with her, but she started using the Lord's name as a way to get the man to have sex with her. The Lord did not have to force Adam to have sex with Eve. That is horrible, to try to use the Lord's name to get someone to sleep with you. And some people even use scriptures to try to get someone to sleep with them. So again, with ministers, when they do root cause analysis, they have to dig a little bit deeper, as opposed to, in a sense, just listen to the stories. There's times when they have to ask profound questions. And like with marriage counseling, one of the key questions asked, and ask them separately, is how did they meet? How do they know that the other person was the one that the Lord ordained? Questions like that, you'd be surprised, because and I know people have different perspective, but if two people's story who are supposed to be in a marriage are, in a sense, diametrically opposed, if those stories are diametrically opposed, there's an issue. If one person is professing love and the other person is saying, I never loved him or her, that is an issue. That is a sign that God was never in it. But with the same thing, when a lot of ministers talk about how David got in trouble, they say it was because David stayed back while other kings went to battle. Sure, that was a part of it, but it runs much deeper than that. And it came to pass in eventide that David arose off his bed. David was in his bed, mind his own business, and walked upon the roof of the king's house. And from the roof he saw a woman washing herself, and the woman was very beautiful to look upon. The Bible talks about when we face temptation, that the Lord gives us a way out. That the Lord gives us a way out. It is up to us to take the way out. And we shouldn't say that God tempted us. No, we fell because of our own lustful desires. He saw that she was beautiful to look upon. The thing is, David had other wives that were beautiful to look upon. When you look in 1 Samuel 25, it talks about how David met Abigail. She was married at the time. One of the things it talks about was that Abigail was a beautiful woman. So David had at least one wife who was beautiful to look upon. So David's way of escape could have been, he saw the woman taking a bath. He was intrigued by her. he could have gone to one of his wives. But it continues. And David sent and inquired after the woman. See, the temptation presented itself, but now David was pursuing it. Be careful what you pursue. What you get may not be what you're looking for. And when you read 2 Samuel 12, David got a whole lot more than he bargained for. But I continue. Inquired after a woman, and one said, Is not this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? That was a stop sign right there. The wife of Uriah the Hittite. But he continued. And David sent messengers and took her, and she came in unto him, and he lay with her, for she was purified from her uncleanness. And she returned unto her house. She was purifying herself after her uncleanness. Feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but from what I recall, when a woman menstruates, it means the egg that was ready for fertilization is flushed out with her menstrual cycle, and it turns into the corpus luteus, or corpus luteum if I recall correctly, and it is flushed out. So when she was cleansing herself after menstruating, then that should mean she shouldn't have been able to get pregnant. Again, correct me if I'm wrong. It has been a while. And there's a book behind me about emergency medical technician stuff. But it has been a while. So I'm thinking that should be impossible for her to get pregnant. It's kind of like, well, what's going on there? So please, if you have more information than I just presented, please correct me if I'm wrong. And the woman conceived and sent and told David and said, I am with child. So David, he should have gone out to battle like other kings. He did not. He sent Joab and his men. They were victorious in battle. David stayed in Jerusalem. He was in his bed, in a sense, minding his own business, went out onto his balcony, saw Bathsheba, was intrigued by her, but rather than going to one of his many wives, he called for her, even after finding out that she was married. And I have questions regarding how we end up having an affair with a married woman. And she got pregnant. But why did David do something like that? As far as I can see, based on root cause analysis in the Bible, and I'm not making excuses because there are some people, for example, who committed adultery, and there's really no excuse with the exception that they were just satisfying lustful desires. But David had a lifetime of rejection. When a person has a lifetime of rejection, it builds up certain things in them. So David went from a lifetime of rejection to someone who is now in power. He had many wives, so things had changed. So it's almost like it was hard for anyone to deny David any pleasure that he sought. In 1 Samuel 16, when the Lord sent Samuel to anoint one of Jesse's sons as Israel's next king, 7 of Jesse's sons appeared before Samuel. They left David amongst the sheep. They didn't even consider him as being the potential next king. So that kind of gives you an impression of what David went through as a young man. And by the way, what I'm speaking to also addresses some ministers, because they went through a life of lack. They went through a life of maybe no one paid attention to them. But now, maybe they have a God-given title or a self-imposed title. When they speak, people listen to them. Now they have authority, and they end up abusing their power. But it goes back to the point where there was a time, in a sense, they were rejected. But I know that is at least for some ministers, a part of the Lord's process for them is for them to deal with rejection. Because it goes both ways. The Lord will take a person, for example, through a season of being rejected. That way, when he elevates that individual, he or she doesn't succumb to power. Because there are times when a person will come into your life and they will try to fill you with pride, puff your ego up, calling you a powerful man or woman of God. But it's a part of manipulation. And the Lord doesn't want his ministers craving attention to the point where they start serving people as opposed to him. So back to David. The Lord sent Samuel to anoint one of Jesse's sons as Israel's next king. They had David out in the sheep, didn't even consider him. And even after David had been anointed as Israel's next king, in front of his family, some of his brothers were in the army. Jesse sent his son David to go check on those sons and also to take some food to them. And Goliath was defying the army of the living God. And David was infuriated. And in 2 Samuel 17, verses 26 through 29, and David spake to the men that stood by him, saying, What shall be done to the man that killeth this Philistine, and taketh away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God? And the people answered him after this manner, saying, So shall it be done to the man that killeth him. David was a warrior. He was a man after the Lord's heart. He was a man after the Lord's heart. That was part of the reason why the Lord selected him as Israel's next king. He had been anointed in front of his family, so they knew he was going to be the next king. But when he showed up, and Eliab, his eldest brother, heard when he spake unto the men, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David, and he said, Why camest thou down hither? And with whom hast thou left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know thy pride, and the naughtiness of thine heart, for thou art come down that thou mightest see the battle. So even after David had been exalted, he was the king in waiting, his brothers were still rejected him. No respect. And David said, What have I now done? Is there not a cause? So it's kind of like David's like, what now? How are you going to beat me up again? So just imagine, David probably going through a lifetime of rejection. Now he was a king, a man of power. Maybe you don't, but I can see why he did certain things. And you may have seen it where someone was exalted to a certain position and the person fell. When the Lord called me to serve him, he told me basically 4 words: minister to the people. That was it. Minister to the people. Well, years later, when it went from being called to the commissioning, the Lord said some things to me. But coming out of that, I'm not going to share the title. What I will tell you is what the Lord said to me, and it hit me in a profound way. To whom much is given, much is required. To whom much is given, much is required. With David, he was given much. Much was required of him. Where you can see how those things from his childhood played a role regarding his decisions. When Nathan rebuked David in 2 Samuel 12, he told him a parable of a rich man who had many sheep, but he took the one sheep from a poor man, killed it, and gave it to another man, his visitor, as a meal. And it was symbolic of how David had many wives, many women to choose from. In fact, when David fled after his son Absalom rose up against him, David actually left 10 concubines behind, just 10 concubines. But he had other wives. So there wasn't a shortage of women for David to choose from. But through the Lord's grace, the Lord gave him a chance. And you can read in 2 Samuel 3 and 5 to see about David's many wives and children. So there wasn't a shortage of women. There are a lot of things that should have stopped David from being with Bathsheba, but he went there and he paid dearly. Bathsheba had the child, but the child died after she gave birth. But then the Lord actually blessed them with a child, Solomon. Solomon replaced David. This is also a key thing. How relationships start matter. Solomon replaced David. Solomon had some of the same issues as David did when it came to women. Going to do a little bit of root cause analysis with Solomon also. Because again, I don't like just looking at the fruit. I like going all the way down to the root. And some of the things that David went through, Solomon went through. And then there's this thing called iniquity. And the Bible talks about sins, transgressions, and iniquity. And iniquity is something that's built up inside of you. I think David said, I think it was in the 51st Psalm, about being conceived in iniquity. See, Solomon was conceived in iniquity. Even though David ended up marrying Bathsheba, because of the way that relationship started, it wasn't good. And when the roots are bad, the fruits are bad. With Solomon, in 1 Kings 11, and I'll read verses 1 through 8. Please bear with me. But King Solomon loved many strange women, together with the daughter of Pharaoh, women of the Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Zidonians, and Hittites, of the nations concerning which the Lord said unto the children of Israel, Ye shall not go into them, neither shall they come in unto you, for surely they will turn away your heart after their gods. Solomon clave unto these in love. Also, nothing. The story I gave you about that short-lived quote-unquote marriage for 3 days, even in those 3 days, it was turning the man's heart away from God. So you can see why the Lord would step in. And Solomon, he started off in great standing with the Lord. The Lord visited him twice. David was a warrior. He started off with Goliath, and he was in battles ever since. He was fighting. But the Lord gave Solomon peace. Solomon didn't have to worry about those battles. A part of the reason why David could have built the temple of the Lord was because he had blood on his hands. Solomon did not have blood on his hands, so he was the one who built the temple of the Lord. He had peace. The Lord gave him wisdom and wealth. He wasn't lacking for anything. And there are times when the Lord will give people, like, you can say all the desires of their heart, and they get too comfortable where they start straying away from the Lord. So Lord gave that warning. Solomon didn't heed. And because he got involved with the wrong people, or the wrong woman, they started turning his heart away from the Lord. There are times when I hear people say that God hates divorce, and he does. But there are times when people don't believe that the Lord will break up a marriage. Why? Because if those two people remain together, one person is going to turn the other person's heart away from him. and sometimes a divorce, is better than being damned in hell. Again, in John 10:10 or John 10, Jesus said that no one is going to pluck his sheep out of his hands. In Matthew 5, the Lord talks about if your eye offends you, about plucking it out. If your right hand offends you, cutting it off. Sometimes that's what it takes to maintain your salvation. You have to work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. King Solomon got involved with these women. They turned his heart. Now here's the kicker. David had quite a few wives. But Solomon, he took it to levels beyond that level. And he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines. And his wives turned away his heart. 1,000 women. King Solomon could be with a new woman every night for 1,000 nights. We're talking about more than 2 years. He could see one woman today and not see her for about 3 years because he's spending time with others. But it's like, why? But even though he had all those women and some of them turned his heart away from God, if the devil can get you with that one person, that one wrong person, it will have a negative impact on your relationship with the Lord. Unless something gives. But then I also have to ask, why did Solomon have all those wives? And some people may say, well, it was probably for political reasons where he would marry those women, make peace with those kings, those nations, so it's for the sake of peace. But again, a little bit of root cause analysis will take you deeper than that. For it came to pass that when Solomon was old, that his wives turned away his heart after other gods. And his heart was not perfect with the Lord, his God, as was the heart of David his father. So even after David's transgression, was talking about his heart being perfect with God. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Zidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. And I'll go down to verse 6. And Solomon did evil in the sight of the Lord, and went not fully after the Lord, as David his father. You can pass things down to the next generation. David did bad, and Solomon did worse. Yes, David took a man's wife, had her husband killed, but he repented. He turned back to God. He never started worshiping other gods. King Solomon, he started worshiping other gods. When you look at the first, or when you look at 10 Commandments, the first 2 are speaking about idolatry, having no other gods. The first 2. King Solomon violated those by bringing other gods into Israel. But it's kind of like, why would Solomon do that? I mean, he was a king. He had all these things at his hand. He had peace. A lot of kings back in those days wished they had peace. But for that, let's go to 1 Kings 5. Or, of course, in 1 Kings 1. This was when David was on his deathbed. And there was a struggle regarding who was going to be David's successor. It made sense in the natural that Adonijah, the eldest surviving son, would take the reins. But that was not God's will. It also speaks to the fact that when you do root cause analysis, there are times when people will try to do what they want and even making it seem as if it's God's will, but it's not God's will. And when God's will prevail, then they start complaining. The Lord's not a respecter of persons, and he will hurt your feelings, especially if he warned you not to do something and you did it anyhow. He is God. He's not going to bend to satisfy your needs or your desires. So in 1 Kings 1, verse 5, David was on his deathbed. Then Adonijah, the son of Haggith, exalted himself, saying, I will be king. And he prepared him chariots and horsemen and 50 men to run before him. If you exalt yourself, the Lord will humble you. But when you humble yourself, then he will exalt you. So Adonijah took it upon himself. And a lot of people, they do things and expect the Lord to bless it afterwards. They create a mess and then expect the Lord to bless their mess. Don't complain when you do what you want to do and then the Lord steps in and then his will prevails. So that's 1 Kings 1 verse 5. But then we go down to 11 through 14. And it speaks to King Solomon's situation and the things that he went through with his family. And you'll see similarities between him and David. Wherefore Nathan spake unto Bathsheba, the mother of Solomon, saying, Hast thou not heard that Adonijah, the son of Haggith, doth reign, and David our Lord knoweth it not? There are times when people do things as if the Lord isn't watching. Again, it's the Lord's purpose that prevails. Now therefore, come, let me, I pray thee, give thee counsel that thou mayest save thine own life and the life of thy son Solomon. Nathan the prophet, a righteous man, was going to give Bathsheba good counsel. Just because a person has a quote-unquote godly title doesn't mean that person is going to give you godly counsel. Sometimes we give you good counsel, but it's not godly counsel. And in some cases, people give you bad advice. It may sound good to you, but you take it and it won't go well for you. And Adonijah, in his actions, he wasn't alone. There were people who were feeding his ego, feeding his pride, encouraging him to do what he did. And they all suffered. So it continues. Go and get thee into King David, and say unto him, Didst not thou, my lord, O king, swear unto thine handmaiden, saying, Assuredly, Solomon thy son shall reign after me, and he shall sit upon my throne. Why doth then Adonijah reign? That also speaks to how sometimes when a person does something, sometimes it may affect your life. Then it's time to take it to the Lord. And in some cases, the Lord may have made a promise to you, but a person comes along and tries to block you from reaching up, getting that promise. And you have to go to the Lord and say, okay, Lord, didn't you promise this? And you know, I snap my finger. It's not that the Lord's going to basically jump at your command, so to speak. But when you petition the Lord, he will move mountains for you. So, behold, while thou yet talkest there with the king, I also will come in after thee and confirm thy words. And Bathsheba went in unto the king, into the chamber, and the king was very old. And Abishag the Shunammite ministered unto the king. I could go in another story about Abishag, but I'll save it for another time. But Bathsheba received counsel from Nathan the prophet. Good counsel, godly counsel. So she went in and spoke with David. Nathan showed up, and David gave him instructions to make Solomon king. And there's something I skipped over. Back in verse 12, where Nathan said, I pray thee, give thee counsel that thou mayest save thine own life and the life of thy son Solomon. Because Adonijah had set himself up as king, the life, or Solomon's life, was in danger. There's one more thing that I skipped over. When Adonijah went to set himself up as king, he invited David's other living children, but he did not invite Solomon. So you can see the similarities to how Solomon, being ostracized by his family, by his siblings, that they shared the same trait as David. David had an issue with women. Solomon had an issue with women. But I also say this: there are things that run in your family that you have the power to break. Those iniquities, ask the Lord to help you purge those iniquities, to get them out of your system. And David, when he saw Bathsheba, and he lusted after her, and he pursued her, when you know you have certain iniquities that run in your family, you have to work extra hard to flee from those things. In fact, one of my favorite scriptures in the Bible, James 4:7. When you have an iniquity, you truly have to remember this. Submit yourselves, therefore, to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. David had many options so that he could flee from the situation regarding Bathsheba. But he didn't. And he fell. Solomon ended up going through many things that David did. When you do the root cause analysis, you can see how people going through things during their childhood, it may lay dormant for a while, but how those things can manifest into adulthood and have negative consequences. Didn't really go in depth with a lot of these things, but I hope that in going over the issues that David and later Solomon had, that you can see how things from their past contributed to their present struggles. And hopefully it'll help you identify the things that you're dealing with. If you find yourself, when you're dealing with struggles, that you have a tendency to blame shift, you truly have to look at your contributions to that issue. Do a root cause analysis of yourself. Or seek godly counsel. There are some people who have ministries and they specialize in deliverance and inner healing. And you may need to see someone like that who does inner healing. And I actually went through that once. Deep healing. And it's 2016 and I went through it a couple of months ago. There were some eye-opening things, but it allowed me to sever certain things. And when I mentioned about James 4:7, about submit yourselves therefore to God, resist the devil and he will flee, it gave me some tools to handle certain situations. In Genesis 4, the Lord told Cain that sin was crouching at his door and it desires to have him, but he must rule over him. That is what we have to do. We have to do a root cause analysis on ourselves, know our strengths and our weaknesses. A lot of times people just want to present their strengths and not acknowledge their weaknesses. But you need to know your weaknesses. A lot of times people think that the devil, when he attacks a person, he attacks their weaknesses. Sometimes he attacks their strength. That's where pride comes in. You may think that you're strong in an area, so you won't be able to succumb. and the devil will prove you wrong. So you have to be on guard. You have to know your strengths and your weaknesses, because the devil, he's always looking for things to exploit. So you have to be on guard. And when you do stuff, don't say the devil made you do it, because a lot of times the Lord made a way of escape, but you chose not to take it. And in fact, the story I mentioned with the man and the woman, when the man found out that the woman was a fraud, he simply wanted to get the marriage annulled, move on as if nothing ever happened. But rather than just coming clean, the woman wanted to put up a fight. And even changing her name to match his was an example of her putting up a fight. But now she's the one who has to explain, how's it she got married but no one's ever met her husband? Or how's it her name changed but no one's claiming her as being his wife? Root cause analysis. It can be a lifesaver. So please, fruits are important, but sometimes you have to take it all the way down to the root. And especially if you're going to be in a relationship with someone where you're seeing their fruits, and especially when they're presenting their good fruits, you need to see the other side. And you also need to get to know the roots. No one's perfect, but you truly know what you're getting into, what you can expect. And the two of you have to develop strategies regarding things that you need to mitigate, or else it will cause issues. When the Lord is in a relationship, you can always take it to Him. I think I've said enough. I hope this helps. This message is not for everyone, because some people probably didn't make it this far. That's fine. You can either choose to accept the truth and learn something and improve yourself, or possibly keep on making the same mistakes that you've done in time past. And it's said that the definition of insanity is trying to do the same thing over and over again while expecting different results.